Okay, just hoping that that keeps the camera from shutting off. I've had to re-record several 15-20 minute sections of these lectures with you because the camera turns off after a certain amount of time and I can't really figure out how to stop that. I want to talk also now about the crisis of contracting a sexually transmitted infection. And so think about that. It's a sexually transmitted infection, and it is a crisis, you know, for most people. Most people are going to find out about the fact that they have a sexually transmitted infection because of symptoms that they receive. It's possible that their partner will tell them about it, but it's also possible that the partner won't or doesn't know. Sometimes people find out about this at their medical doctor's office when they get, you know, some care for it. And so this is a certain kind of very private and embarrassing crisis, and something that you might end up having to help a client with also. So, you know, I'm 62 years old. When I was in my 20s, this was referred to as VD, or venereal disease. And then we went through the time, I guess, I don't know, maybe from the 90s until now, where they were referred to as STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. And now the more politically, I guess, appropriate title is sexually transmitted infections. But even that phrase, our author, Christy Cannell, suggests that you avoid sort of using that. It has a lot of, I don't know, stigma attached to it, really. If you talk about a sexually transmitted infection, I don't know, she says it's probably better just to say to the person, excuse me, you know, let's talk about your chlamydia infection, or your syphilis infection, or your gonorrhea infection, or your hepatitis C infection. So I can see, wow, lots of healthcare workers doing probably frontline explaining to clients, and then also maybe you would be a crisis worker who's trying to help a client wade through their emotions related to this. You know, you also might end up working with a client, and the crisis for them is how do they tell their partner or their spouse that they've contracted this infection if they have been, you know, having intercourse outside of the bounds of that relationship. So there are some ways that this can be a really dicey conversation and a crisis. Also, I would think teenagers too, for sure. Gay and lesbian people, but particularly gay men, or young boys who are gay, you know, having to tell their parents about this is another way that this could be a crisis for a person. So sexually transmitted infections. Here's some facts from the book, half of STIs, new cases each year, are with people from the ages of 15 to 24. So 15 is at the young end of that. That's young, that's teenage time, right? And I'm not naive enough to think that teenagers aren't going to be sexually active. In fact, they will. There is not much we can do about that. But it is a time in life where dealing with the seriousness of a medical condition can be scary for a young person. And, you know, again, teenagers, I think, sometimes are apt to just not take responsibility for things and to live in a state of denial about things. Just being scared to take action, not knowing how to take action, hoping that it'll just go away. And so there are some serious implications for letting a sexually transmitted infection just go on and on. For example, it's just super important. Untreated syphilis can lead to visual impairment and stroke. And syphilis is a disease, a sexually transmitted infection that, you know, more than 90% of new cases of syphilis are men. And so I can see where this could be a particular issue for young gay men, you know, not really wanting to maybe take this on and deal with it and get medical care for it. Some of these infections can lead to infertility, and so it's important really to somehow get the word out to teenagers that if they think they have an infection, that they should be getting health care for it. Men who have sex with men account for the majority of, you know, as I said to you, for about 83% of male cases. So I'm going to say that again. men who have sex with men account for 83% of cases of sexually transmitted infections. That is huge. And so that population, if I were maybe a high school counselor and I knew, who the population was at my school, or maybe I would just want to do some public kind of education campaign to teens about this because the rates are so high. Hepatitis C is another one of these very dangerous infections, and it's interesting to note that boomers, baby boomers, people that are born between the ages of 1946 and 1964 should be tested for hepatitis C, and that there is treatment for it now. It's a relatively new treatment, and so Hep C is transmitted 3 different ways. It can be sexually transmitted. It can also be it was before transmitted through IV drug use and also blood transfusions. And so it's interesting to me that the baby boomer generation is most at risk for this, and they're the ones who are dying from it. And in fact, a neighbor 3 houses down from me died from hepatitis C a couple of years ago. And of course, I have no idea how he transmitted it. It's not my business, but he certainly fell into that generation. So hepatitis C is a thing that would be interesting for you to know more about. Even as you are a younger helper, some of you are pretty young, in your 20s and 30s, you might end up working somewhere where you're doing some counseling with people who have contracted hepatitis C and are getting the treatment for it. Okay, how to do crisis intervention for individuals and couples who are dealing with sexually transmitted infections. Well, this is another category of crisis counseling that you need a lot of solid scientific information for. I can see myself maybe having a electronic file that I might offer to send to a person that gives them facts about treatment, facts about symptoms, maybe even an electronic file that I would send that has to do with how you feel about this and the ways that people kind of experience this. Websites and so on. So factual information here is really important to be able to deliver. But additionally, there's some emotional support that people who are having this experience need from us. The first thing they need is a non-judgmental attitude from us. We need to be able, as you know, for the ABC crisis model, that A sort of stage of helping has to do with connecting with the client in a non-judgmental way so that they feel trusted and accepted and they can tell that you're empathic. That needs to happen. That's really important because there's some shame, and sometimes people talk about feeling dirty, for having contracted a sexually transmitted disease. And so this is an important factor for you to be able to communicate. I want to just say a few more facts about this. Any woman who is sexually active and younger than age 25 should get annual testing for chlamydia and gonorrhea. This is part of the protocol now, but if young people aren't getting regular reproductive health care, this is something that they need to know about, actually. Gay and bisexual men should request testing for all of these sexually transmitted infections on an annual basis. Again, I can see young, people maybe not feeling like they're sick and they don't go to the doctor. They might not have health coverage, and they might not think that it's important to go to the health department and get an annual checkup for sexually transmitted infections. In fact, I can imagine that this is pretty true across the board, really. Although I guess I would think that women are probably getting reproductive health care because most people at that age are on some kind of birth control or using some kind of birth control. But anyway, just think about that. That's important. Again, more important factual information to give to people. Education about these issues is important as a crisis worker, and you might be the person that a client wants to talk to about this. And also, as people go through treatment, they may need to talk about it and get some support. people can feel sort of this sense of self-disgust and definitely some anger if they've got transmitted this disease through a sexual partner. They might know who that partner is, or they might not know who that partner is if they have had several sexual partners. And so a feeling of just indignance that you have contracted a disease if you take really good care of yourself can be something that you need some support for. So using educational statements here, validation statements, giving all kinds of information are helpful. Universalizing can be a useful tool to use. I can see myself saying, I've worked with a lot of young gay guys, and this is a thing that happens. You're not the only person that this happens to, and people feel the way that you feel about it, and so that a person doesn't feel like they're the only one who's feeling this way. A reframe that you could offer is telling the client, it's very good that you're here and you're getting treatment for this, good for you, instead of the client, with working with cognitions like, I hate myself, or I'm so ashamed of this, or I must be a bad person, why would this happen to me? Think about ways of reframing those cognitions. Again, like we talk about all the time in our crisis intervention model for this textbook, we're looking at cognitions. We're trying to help the client figure out how they're feeling, what they're thinking in their mind. We want to help them by being able to discover what are the worst things that are in your head about this. So what's the worst thing about this whole situation for you? And so remember, always getting to the cognitive key, the point of that is to help the client with the place where they're suffering the most. Because if we know what the client is thinking and telling themselves over and over again, that's the level, that's the place in the client's emotional life that is troubling them the most. And that's where we can do some good by helping the client reframe or change those cognitions, or by giving the client good educational information so that they're not judging themselves and feeling a lot of shame over this. Well, I hope that you have gotten something out of this chapter. This is certainly an area of real life that you might end up helping a client with. And so read the chapter, and then we'll talk about this when we meet in our Collaborate session on Wednesday live.